In a world where assumptions often shape people's actions, one simple moment of prejudice could change the course of someone's life forever. What happens when a racist man calls the cops on an innocent black man, only to have security footage expose the truth? The city buzzed with life. The streets were lined with office buildings, coffee shops, and hurried footsteps. Cars honked in the distance as businessmen rushed from one meeting to the next. People barely looked up from their phones, navigating the sidewalks with the precision of someone who had done this routine 100 times before. Amidst the chaos of this urban jungle, a man sat alone on a worn-down bench near the entrance of a corporate high-rise. He was a black man, his clothes slightly wrinkled, a duffel bag resting beside him. His face was calm, eyes focused on the people moving past him. He wasn't bothering anyone, simply watching the world as it rushed by. But to some, his presence alone was enough to warrant suspicion. A well-dressed white man in an expensive navy blue suit strode down the sidewalk. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement, his posture upright, exuding the confidence of someone who had never had to second-guess his place in the world. His name was Richard Caldwell, a senior executive in one of the financial firms in the towering building just ahead. His morning had been going smoothly, an espresso from his favorite cafe, a brief call with his assistant to confirm his schedule. But as he neared the entrance, his gaze landed on the black man sitting on the bench. Richard's steps faltered for half a second. His eyes lingered, his mind instantly making calculations. The man looked out of place, sitting there with no obvious purpose. No briefcase, no business attire, just a duffel bag. Richard's jaw tightened. He had seen too many news stories about crime creeping into the good parts of the city. As he passed, he stole another glance, his mind filling in the blanks without a shred of real evidence. Homeless? Maybe. Looking for trouble? Possibly. A danger to the people in the building? He wasn't willing to take that chance. With a subtle movement, Richard pulled his phone from his pocket. His fingers hovered over the screen as he hesitated. Was he overreacting? He shook off the thought. Better safe than sorry, he told himself. He pressed the emergency number. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious individual outside my building," he said quietly, stepping aside near the entrance. A black man, mid-30s, sitting outside with a bag. I don't know what he's doing, but he's been here for a while, and it just seems off. Could you send someone to check it out? The dispatcher acknowledged his request, and Richard hung up. He glanced back once more. The man hadn't moved, still seated, watching the city move around him. He wasn't begging, wasn't talking to anyone, just existing. Richard exhaled, pushing aside the brief unease creeping into his chest. He had done what he thought was right. If the man was harmless, there was no issue. But if he wasn't, then he had potentially prevented something worse. Minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up to the curb. Two officers stepped out, their expressions unreadable as they made their way toward the man on the bench. Richard watched from the glass doors of his building, arms crossed. The black man looked up as the officers approached. There was no fear in his eyes, no panic, just quiet recognition, as if this wasn't the first time someone had assumed the worst about him. "Sir, we need you to stand up," one of the officers said firmly. The man frowned but complied, moving slowly to his feet. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice calm. "We got a call about a suspicious individual matching your description," the officer said, glancing at the duffel bag at his side. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" The man exhaled, rubbing his temple. "I'm waiting for my job interview." Richard, still watching, felt his stomach twist slightly. "Interview?" one officer asked, skeptical. "Yes." The man nodded toward the towering office building. "With Caldwell and Sons Financial. I was supposed to meet with the hiring manager 15 minutes ago, but I got here early and was just gathering my thoughts." A silence stretched between them. "You got any ID on you?" the second officer asked. The man nodded, reaching into his bag carefully before pulling out a neatly folded resume and a company email printout with his interview details. The officer took the paper, reading it over. His expression shifted, eyebrows raising slightly, before he looked toward the glass doors where Richard was standing. Richard felt his heart pound against his rib cage. The name on the document was clear, and beneath it, in bold letters, was the company name. Caldwell and Sons Financial. Richard's breath caught. He was the one who had arranged the interview. He was the one who had asked his hiring manager to find new talent for an entry-level position. And he had just called the cops on his own candidate. The weight of his mistake crashed over him like a tidal wave. The officers exchanged a look before nodding at David. "Seems like there's no issue here," one muttered, handing the paper back. David took it, stuffing it carefully back into his bag before locking eyes with Richard through the glass. For the first time, Richard saw him clearly, not as a faceless figure on a bench, not as a threat, but as a man. A man who had walked into this morning with hope and had been met with suspicion instead. Richard swallowed hard, shame creeping up his spine. The officers gave a brief nod before heading back to their cruiser, leaving David standing alone. The tension in the air was thick, unspoken but undeniable. And in that moment, Richard realized something. One simple moment of prejudice had nearly cost a man his dignity, nearly cost him an opportunity, and it had nearly cost Richard his own integrity. Would you have reacted differently in Richard's place? How often do we let assumptions dictate our actions? Share your thoughts in the comments, because conversations like this are how we start to change. David sat on the worn wooden bench, watching the world move past him. The sun cast long shadows across the pavement as businessmen hurried by, their expensive shoes clicking against the sidewalk. Mothers pushed strollers, teenagers scrolled through their phones, and taxis honked impatiently in the street. It was just another day in the city. But for David, today was different. Today was supposed to be the day things turned around. His fingers clutched the strap of his duffel bag, the only possession he had brought with him for the interview. Inside were neatly pressed clothes he had borrowed from a neighbor, a resume he had spent hours refining, and a folder with all the paperwork he thought he might need. This wasn't just an interview to him, it was a lifeline, a chance to step out of the struggle that had defined so much of his life. He had spent years working low-paying jobs, doing what he could to survive. Growing up in a rough neighborhood had taught him resilience, but no matter how hard he worked, he always felt like he was one step behind. People saw his worn-out sneakers and his tired eyes before they saw his ambition. They saw his skin before they saw his skills. It didn't matter how many times he proved himself. The world always seemed to decide who he was before he even opened his mouth. Across the street, Richard strode forward with purpose, his polished leather shoes glistening under the afternoon sun. His suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted. He was a man who had never known what it was like to wonder where his next meal would come from, a man who had never been turned away from an opportunity based on appearance alone. Everything in his world had been built on certainty, on knowing that doors would open when he knocked. He had worked hard, of course. He had climbed the corporate ladder, made smart investments, built a name for himself in finance. But his success had always come with the unspoken understanding that the world saw him as someone who belonged in those spaces. No one had ever questioned his presence in an office building. No one had ever doubted his credibility before he had the chance to prove it. That privilege was so ingrained in him that he didn't even recognize it as privilege. As he approached the entrance to his office building, his eyes landed on David, sitting on the bench. He barely registered the tension in the man's shoulders, the way he carefully adjusted his belongings as people walked past him. Instead, Richard saw only what his mind was conditioned to see: an older black man alone, with a duffel bag at his feet. His pace slowed slightly. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. The building had strict security, but still, he hated when people loitered near the entrance. It made clients uncomfortable. And though the man wasn't begging or harassing anyone, his presence felt out of place. Richard exhaled sharply. He had read too many headlines about rising crime in the city, people getting robbed in broad daylight, businesses being targeted. It was always best to be cautious, wasn't it? He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. He hesitated for only a second before dialing. David adjusted his seat, glancing up briefly as Richard walked by. He could feel it, the unspoken judgment in his eyes. He was used to it. The way people looked at him when he walked into certain stores, the way security guards subtly trailed him when he browsed. It didn't matter what he was wearing or how polite he was. People had already made up their minds. He sighed, shifting the duffel bag closer to his feet. His interview was in 15 minutes. He had planned to go inside early, but his nerves had gotten the best of him. He just needed a few minutes to breathe, to remind himself that he belonged there as much as anyone else. Richard stepped off to the side, lowering his voice as he spoke into the phone. "Yeah, there's a guy sitting outside my building. Black male, maybe in his late 40s. He's been here for a while, and he's got a bag with him. I don't know if he's waiting for someone, or if he's up to something, but I just wanted to report it. Could you send someone to check it out?" The dispatcher on the other end confirmed they would send an officer, and Richard hung up. He stole another glance at David, who hadn't moved, still lost in thought. Richard straightened his tie and walked inside, feeling a sense of relief. He had done his part. If there was no problem, then no harm done. But if the man was trouble, at least he had taken action before something could happen. David finally checked his watch, realizing it was time. He took a deep breath, grabbed his duffel bag, and stood up. He had no idea what was coming. As he made his way toward the entrance, a police car pulled up to the curb, the flashing lights reflecting against the building's glass doors. David remained seated, adjusting the strap of his duffel bag as he mentally rehearsed his interview responses. He had gone over them a dozen times that morning, making sure he knew exactly what to say. He had worked too hard to let his nerves get the best of him now. He exhaled slowly, focusing on the building's glass doors just a few steps away. In a few minutes, he would walk in, shake hands with the hiring manager, and prove that he was more than just another face in the crowd. But before he could stand, something felt off. The air around him shifted, an unease creeping up his spine. He wasn't sure what it was at first, but then he noticed it. People passing by were glancing in his direction, some whispering, others stepping aside as if avoiding an invisible barrier. His pulse quickened. He had felt this kind of energy before. Then, the distant wail of sirens pierced through the city noise. His stomach dropped. 2 police officers approached, their expressions unreadable. Their uniforms stood out against the sea of gray suits and polished shoes, their presence shifting the entire mood of the street. Conversations hushed, and the few people who had been walking by slowed their pace, watching the situation unfold. David stiffened as the officers closed in. His hands remained visible, fingers gripping the edge of the bench. He had done nothing wrong, yet years of experience had taught him that innocence didn't always matter. "Sir," one of the officers said firmly, resting a hand near his holster, "we need you to stand up." David's mouth went dry. "What's going on?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "We got a report about a suspicious individual matching your description," the second officer said, glancing at the duffel bag. "We just need to ask you a few questions." David's heart pounded against his ribs. He glanced around, searching for an explanation. But the moment his eyes landed on the glass doors of the building, he saw him. Richard. The well-dressed businessman stood just inside the entrance, watching from behind the safety of the glass. His expression was unreadable, but David knew. He had seen that look before. He had been in this exact position before. Richard had made the call. David's jaw clenched. His entire morning had led to this moment, and now, instead of sitting in an interview chair, he was standing in front of two officers, being treated like a criminal. "I was just sitting here," David said, his voice calm but firm. The officers exchanged a glance. One of them took a step forward, lowering his voice. "Do you have any ID on you?" David nodded slowly. "It's in my bag." He moved carefully, unzipping the duffel bag and pulling out his wallet. The officer took it, flipping through his identification. The tension was thick, heavy enough that the watching crowd seemed to be holding their breath. Then, from the corner of his eye, David noticed something. One of the security guards had stepped outside, a phone in hand. His brows were furrowed as he walked toward the officers, his expression filled with urgency. "Hold on," the guard called out. "You need to see this." The officers paused, their attention shifting. The guard held up his phone, the screen playing a security camera feed from just minutes earlier. The grainy footage showed the sidewalk in front of the building. It captured Richard walking past, glancing at David. Then it showed Richard pulling out his phone, speaking quietly, his gaze locked onto David the entire time. The officer watching the footage frowned, his eyes narrowing slightly. The truth was right there. Richard had called because David was black, because he had assumed, because his prejudice had turned an ordinary moment into a police matter. A silence stretched between them. David inhaled sharply, his frustration barely contained. He had been through this before. He had been profiled, questioned, looked at like he didn't belong. But this time, he had the truth on his side. The first officer exhaled, handing David his wallet back. "You're free to go," he said, his tone quieter now. David nodded, stuffing his wallet back into his bag. He didn't say anything as he zipped it shut. Didn't look at the officers as they turned away. Instead, he locked eyes with Richard through the glass doors. And for the first time, Richard looked away first. David could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. But while one man was consumed with shame, the other stood taller than ever, because the truth had finally been revealed. One of the officers adjusted his radio, exchanging a brief glance with his partner, as the security guard replayed the footage. The gathered crowd stood frozen, their eyes locked on the screen. The silent video told a very different story than the one Richard had led them to believe. The grainy, black-and-white footage captured the moment Richard first approached the scene. At first, it seemed innocent, just a man walking past another sitting on a bench. But then something unexpected happened. Richard didn't just walk by. He hesitated, slowed down. He took a step toward the black man. His eyes darted around, checking his surroundings. Then, in an almost imperceptible motion, he reached toward the duffel bag sitting beside David. The air in the crowd shifted as the realization spread. Richard hadn't been wary of David. He had been targeting him. The officers leaned in closer, their brows furrowed as the footage played on. David, unaware at first, had caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. The footage showed him reacting swiftly, yanking the bag toward him before Richard could get a grip on it. The businessman stumbled slightly, hands withdrawing, his expression flickering between frustration and panic. Then, the most damning part. Richard, after failing in his attempt, took a step back, pulled out his phone, and immediately began making his call. The video showed him speaking into the receiver, eyes still fixed on David, all while composing the very story that had led the police to arrive in the first place. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. People exchanged stunned glances, some whispering to one another. The weight of the revelation was sinking in. One of the officers straightened, eyes hardening as he turned to Richard. "Sir, can you explain this?" Richard's face had lost all color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His usually polished, confident demeanor had cracked. There must be some mistake," he stammered. "That video doesn't show the whole story. The officer held up a hand. "We saw enough." He gestured to his partner, who immediately reached for his cuffs. "Sir, I'm placing you under arrest for filing a false report and attempted theft." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Richard's head snapped up. "What? No, this is insane. I was trying to stop a potential threat." The officer shook his head. "You tried to steal this man's bag, then called the police to cover your tracks. That's what the footage shows. And given what just happened here, I'm willing to bet this wasn't the first time you've pulled something like this." David stood completely still, processing everything. He had spent years being accused, questioned, doubted for no reason other than who he was. And yet, here it was. Undeniable proof that it wasn't him who had been in the wrong. For once, the system had turned its focus on the real problem. Richard turned desperately to the crowd, as if hoping someone would vouch for him. But all he saw were blank stares, some disapproving, some disgusted. He had played himself into a corner, and there was no way out. The officer gripped Richard's arm, locking the cuffs around his wrists. "You have the right to remain silent," he began, his voice level. Richard's protests faded into the background as the reality of the situation settled over everyone. David slowly exhaled, the tightness in his chest loosening just a little. He met the eyes of the security guard who had brought out the footage, offering a small nod of appreciation. The guard returned it, almost as if saying, "This never should have happened to you." The crowd, which had initially gathered in curiosity, was now witnessing something far bigger than just an arrest. It was a reckoning, a moment of truth laid bare. As Richard was led toward the waiting police car, David picked up his duffel bag. He glanced once more at the building in front of him. He was supposed to have been in an interview by now. Then, as if on cue, a woman stepped forward from the entrance of the office building. She was well dressed, her sharp eyes filled with a mix of concern and determination. "David Carter," she called. He turned. "I'm Olivia Daniels," she continued. "I'm the hiring manager you were supposed to meet." David blinked. She glanced at the scene unfolding before them, Richard being placed in the back of a police car, the crowd still whispering. Then she met David's gaze again. "I saw what happened," she said. "Come inside when you're ready." We still want to talk to you." For the first time all day, David let himself smile. The air around the scene was thick with tension, yet a collective realization had settled over the crowd. The truth had unraveled before their eyes, exposing not just Richard's deceit, but the harsh reality of how easily assumptions could escalate into something dangerous. The murmurs of disbelief grew louder as people processed what they had just witnessed. A woman in the crowd shook her head. "I can't believe this," she muttered. "He called the cops on an innocent man, all because of some twisted idea he had in his head." A man beside her scoffed. "And to think, if that security footage hadn't been pulled up, who knows how this would have ended?" David stood still, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. He wasn't surprised. Not really. He had lived this reality for years, this assumption of guilt before innocence, the way the world so often looked at him with suspicion first and humanity second. But today, the truth had come to light in a way that couldn't be ignored. He noticed the eyes of those around him, studying him differently now. They no longer saw just a black man sitting on a bench with a duffel bag. They saw someone who had nearly been a victim of a terrible injustice, and they couldn't deny the role that their own biases had played in it. Just a few feet away, a young boy stood gripping his mother's hand, his wide eyes locked on David. He had been silent through it all, watching as events unfolded. David met the boy's gaze, recognizing the quiet curiosity and realization in his expression. This moment, this lesson, would stay with him for years. He had just witnessed in real time the consequences of prejudice. The mother knelt beside her son, whispering something to him, but his gaze never left David. An older man in the crowd spoke up. "How many times do we have to see this happen before people wake up?" His voice was heavy with frustration. "How many more times do black men have to be put through this before we stop assuming the worst?" A woman who had previously stepped away now returned, looking apologetic. I saw him sitting there earlier," she admitted quietly. "And I won't lie, I thought the same thing Richard did. I didn't call the police, but I judged him. And I was wrong." David nodded, though he said nothing. He had seen people have this revelation before, but it never changed the fact that it always took a public incident like this to open their eyes. As the police car pulled away with Richard in the back seat, the murmurs continued. Some people were still in shock, some ashamed. But the most important thing was that they had seen the truth unfold in real time. The black man they had once looked at with suspicion was now seen for who he truly was, a man just trying to live his life, a man who had done nothing wrong. The security guard who had shown the footage stepped forward and placed a hand on David's shoulder. "You all right, man?" David let out a slow breath, nodding. "Yeah, I think so." The hiring manager, Olivia, cleared her throat and spoke with authority. "David, let's get inside," she said. "Your interview is still waiting." For the first time in what felt like hours, a small smile tugged at David's lips. The day had taken a turn he never could have predicted, but now, at least, it felt like he had a chance to reclaim it. As he turned to walk toward the building, the young boy from the crowd finally spoke. "Mister?" David stopped and looked down at him. The boy hesitated for a moment, then said, "I think you're real brave." David smiled. "Thank you, kid." The boy's mother squeezed his hand, and as David walked inside, he knew that while today had been exhausting, it had also been important. Not just for him, but for every single person who had witnessed what happened. Because the truth had been seen. And once seen, it could never be unseen. As David stepped inside the building, The weight of the moment still lingered in the air. The eyes of the crowd remained fixed on him, their expressions shifting from quiet realization to deep reflection. What had just unfolded wasn't merely an incident. It was a mirror held up to society, exposing the prejudices that operated silently in the background of everyday life. Richard's arrest had shocked many, not just because of the crime itself, but because of how quickly things had escalated based on an assumption. How often did this happen? How many innocent people had been treated unfairly because someone, somewhere, had decided that they looked suspicious. The security footage had revealed an undeniable truth, not just about this one moment, but about the way people perceived one another. David had been sitting on a bench, waiting for an interview. That was all. And yet, it had taken video evidence to clear his name. Without it, who knows how the situation might have played out? That thought settled uncomfortably in the minds of those who had witnessed it. A woman in the crowd turned to her companion and whispered, "I feel terrible. I didn't even question it when the cops showed up. I just assumed." Her voice trailed off, guilt weighing her down. Her companion sighed. Yeah, makes you wonder how often this happens when there aren't cameras to prove the truth. Inside, David shook hands with Olivia, the hiring manager who had witnessed everything. She led him to a conference room where the interview would finally take place. But as he sat down, he knew that today had already tested him in ways no job interview ever could. "Are you okay?" Olivia asked gently, setting her clipboard aside. David let out a slow breath. "I will be." Outside, the young boy who had watched everything still clung to his mother's hand. His gaze remained locked on the entrance to the building, his mind absorbing all that had happened. He had seen something today that he wouldn't forget. It would stay with him as he grew older, shaping the way he viewed the world and the people in it. This was how change began, not with grand speeches or laws, but with moments like this. Moments that forced people to confront their biases, to question their instincts, to recognize the injustices they had been blind to before. Prejudice had nearly ruined a man's future today. But the truth had won. And in that victory, there was hope. The real question was, would the people who had witnessed it let it change them? Would they carry this lesson forward and challenge the way they saw others? Or would it simply be another moment in time, forgotten as soon as the next distraction arrived? How often do we make judgments about people without knowing their story? How many times do we let fear, stereotypes, or past experiences shape how we see a stranger? This story reminds us that before we assume, before we act, we must ask ourselves, are we seeing the person, or just the idea we have built in our minds? What does this story teach us about the way we perceive others? How can we work toward a world where people are judged by their actions, not their appearance? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you question, even for a moment, how we treat others in our society, then let's continue the conversation. Like this video, share it, and subscribe for more stories that challenge perspectives and push for justice. Because change starts with awareness, and awareness starts with stories like these.